Okay, so we are live on Facebook. Welcome to the Mystery Writers of America presents Edgar's Week Symposium, Down the River Unto the Seas, Place and Mood in a Crime Novel. My name is Laurie King. I am the chapter president of the NorCal chapter of Mystery Writers of America. I am also the moderator of this panel. I promise I won't be too moderate. These are 5 of the original 6 Edgar's nominees who are invited to talk about crime and mood. Corianne Haydu was supposed to be with us and she couldn't make it today. But instead, we have William Lashner. He is a former prosecutor with the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. He's been nominated for 2 Seamus Awards, a Gumshoe and an Edgar, and has branched out into writing for kids. Freedom Road is one for adults. Katrina Mcpherson was born in Edinburgh and did a PhD in linguistics from Edinburgh University. After a short burst of academia and a few proper jobs, she's been a full-time writer since 2005 with the Dandy Gilver series, the new humorous Last Ditch series, and a number of darker psychological thrillers, including Strangers at the Gate. Abir Mukherjee is the best-selling author of the Sam Wyndham series of crime novels set in Raj-era India, the third of which, Smoke and Ashes, was chosen by the Sunday Times as one of the 100 best crime and thriller novels since 1945. Abir grew up in Scotland as well, and now lives in London with his wife and sons. Lara Prescott's debut novel, The Secrets We Kept, was an instant New York Times bestseller that will be translated into over 30 languages and adapted for television. Lara has an MFA from the University of Texas and has studied political science in Washington, D.C. and international development in Namibia and South Africa. And John Vercher has an MFA in creative writing from the Mountain View Master of Fine Arts program and served as an adjunct faculty member at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia. His essays on race, identity, and parenting have been picked up by NPR, and he's appeared on WBUR's Weekend Edition. 3/5 was named one of the best books of 2019 by the Chicago Tribune and by other reviews. And as I said, my name is Laurie King. Now, we are here to talk about place and mood. Writers shape books out of character and plot and setting, but the book's mood might be said to be the ground underneath them all, or maybe the air that they move through. Mood is atmosphere, but more than that, mood is the feeling that your novel inspires in a reader. So let's talk first about place or setting. How do you choose where to set your series or your stories to begin with? What details do you use for building a setting, whether it's real or made up? John, let's start with you. How do you choose a place and what do you look for in the way of details?
Well, I've only written one, so the way I chose it for this one in particular was I reached back to a time that reflected a time that I had gone through that was similar to my protagonists and antagonists in the book. So in doing so, that helped me sort of connect with the emotions that I wanted the characters to reveal. And so that was why I chose the setting for Pittsburgh 1995 for this novel.
Okay, and what about you, Lara?
So my book is a work of historical fiction. So my primary places my novel takes place in are Washington, D.C. in the 1950s, as well as the USSR in the 1950s. And I also the book travels around the world. It goes to Italy, London, Paris, etc. But those were the 2 primary places. And Washington, D.C. is a place that I'm really familiar with. I lived there for about a decade after moving there for college, and I worked on political campaigns there for a number of years. But Russia, the USSR, I had obviously never been to, so it was really important for me to travel there and get that experience and write everything I was witnessing down. And it was just absolutely invaluable to me to have the opportunity to visit that place.
Great. What about you, Bill?
Well, the book I wrote, Freedom Road, it's about an old hippie who's kind of having regrets about his life. And I actually started it in Chicago at the 1968 riots during the convention, where he sort of becomes radicalized. And one of the things that happened in the book is he kept on coming back to Chicago. He's Chicago in 68, and then when he's really in his big hippie mode, he's back in 75, confronting the capitalism in the city that his father deals in and kind of rejecting it again. And later in the sad elegy, the elegiac part of the book, he goes back to Chicago one more time, and he's already old, and life has turned out terribly, and the city itself reflects it back to him. And one of the things I liked about that is, when you talk about mood, is every time you see the city through the periods of his life, the mood of the city is different because his mood is different. So it feels like it's energized in the beginning, and it feels like it's sad and rebuking him at the end, and it changes as he changes.
That sounds great.
Well, I love Chicago. It's a great city, and you can find all that stuff in there too. So.
What about you, Katrina?
So what Bill said, no, that sounded so like what an interesting way to structure the movement of a character's life and a place. If I could go and write it down now, I'd write it down and steal it. Mine is I think that, thank you. The mood, I suppose, in Strangers at the Gate, I would say, is claustrophobia and dread. And I did that by taking a real town. It's a real town. It's bigger. You probably know it, Abir, and you might even know it, Laurie, in Lanarkshire. Yeah, it is bigger, the town. But kind of stretching it and squeezing it and putting it into a very narrow, deep valley that doesn't get any sunlight for 6 months of the year. And there are places like that in Scotland, you know, in Switzerland as well. So it's not very complicated or very, I don't suppose it's terribly nuanced, just to give an air of claustrophobia by making they're almost like fairly sheer hillsides very close by and absolutely no light whatsoever, and these ant-like little lives going on in a narrow town in the middle of it.
Sorry, I'm having some problems with the Facebook side of things. Lara, what about you?
That's all right. I'll tell you a wee bit about my books are set in colonial India in the 20s, and you know, for that, the choice of location was quite important to me. I could have gone for Delhi or Bombay or made up some fictitious place, but I thought for me the right place was Calcutta, because it's a city that, you know, not many people know about, or when we do know about it, we tend to know about it because of its poverty. But you know, 150 years ago or 100 years ago, it was the richest city in Asia. Even today, it has, you know, more theatres than London and New York. So it has that other side to it. It's also the city that my parents are from, and it's probably the most bizarre place I've ever been. But it was also the capital of the Raj for many years. And you have this legacy of the British in the fabric of the place, because the city itself, you know, people think it's a very old city, but it's younger than New York. It's younger than Boston. It was built, you know, in traditional British fashion. They decided the best place to put this city was in the middle of a malarial swamp. You know, the worst things, anything that can kill British people can be found in Calcutta, and that's where they built their capital. And so I thought, right, that has to be, you know, the venue for my books. So that's why I chose it.
All these cheerful settings. What about you, Lara?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, I already went, but
you did. Yeah, you did. Sorry. I'm distracted because it's not feeding correctly. So, oh yeah, it just started.
Oh,
You know, I'm just too clever. I thought I could connect it in with the events page, and no, it doesn't do that. So anyway, so sorry about that. So if you are creating the emotional response that we call mood, how do you do that? I mean, what process do you do that as a writer and involving craft? So if, for example, there's a tree growing in front of your protagonist's home, how do you use that to let the reader into the mood that you're building and to suggest what they're going to find going on inside that home before they even step in the door? So how do you as a writer craft that? Let's start with you, Abir, since we're looping our way around.
I tend to use, things like climate and heat. So, for example, Calcutta lends itself to this oppressive humidity. I would imagine it's much like the deep south of America, where it's not the heat that kills you, it's the humidity, but you can use that to build this sort of pressure cooker atmosphere. You can use things like the monsoon as well. These rain, storms that will, blow people away. They're just so powerful. And you can use that to sort of build the sort of tension and the oppressive atmosphere, which I think sort of goes hand in hand with the period and the place that I'm describing, because I'm describing a very oppressive political structure. It's a structure in which most of the people are, subjects of a foreign colonial power. They have no freedom, and that is reflected in this this hothouse atmosphere that you can build with things like climate. You can that sort of fetidness, and I think that close humidity really sort of punctuates the book. People say that we felt the sweat prickling on our brows as we were reading it. I've never had that because I'm from Scotland, but it's nice to hear.
Well, what about our other Scots, Katrina?
Oh, well, the focus of my novel is so tiny compared with what Abir's just been talking about. What I did was, so I've put this protagonist, a city girl, who was born and brought up in what American people would call the projects, but we'd call the big flats. So she's 17th floor with a long view and lots of light and sunshine. And I've put her in what looks like an idyllic setting. She's got a country cottage. She's been given it free, a gate lodge. And so what I did to try and echo the fact that everyone around her is saying everything's lovely, everything's snug, if not smug, in this town, and things are bright and breezy and cheerful and great, is to make the houses. So there's 3 houses. There's her little house that's a country cottage, a gate lodge, and everyone says how cute, how quaint, how beautiful. But it's so ugly, and to her it looks like a toad. It's grey and lumpy and harled, and it's squint, it's like Popeye. It's got one bay window and one set back, so it's kind of misshapen. She thinks it's repulsive, and everyone else says, oh, how charming. And then the bigger house, it's a kind of, arts and crafts, Agatha Christie house, the big house at the top of the drive, that's got one of those round red brick porches that were around at the time that just looks like an open mouth. So the house is, every time she walks into this house, people go, oh, isn't it charming? And she's thinking, what is wrong with you? This is a nightmare. And then there's a third house. There's another house that we don't hear about until maybe halfway through the book, that everyone keeps talking about, and it's the big house that where the stone for the flat bit where the wee houses are was quarried out of there, and it's the big house. It's got no roof and it's all boarded up. It burnt down when a mother killed herself and her children. So there's a bit of foreboding about this house, and I like the idea that people keep talking about it and it's very much there, but we don't go there. So to me, that helped with the general dread and unsettling feeling of this new transplant into the... In fact, I'm such a pantser, sorry to go on, but I'm such a pantser that I'd put this house there and no one had to go there. And I was writing along thinking, they're going to have to go there sometime. I'm going to have to show this house because I've talked about it. And then maybe about 3/4 of the way through, I was thinking, oh, so she's looking for something. Where's she going to look? Ha ha! I know where she's going to look. She's going to go to the big house. So she goes round. It's all boarded up. And then there's this moment. I'm really enjoying remembering this, sorry, where she goes round again and one of the boards has gone. So it's like you look at a corpse and look away, look at a corpse and look away, then you look at a corpse and its eyes are open. So it's maybe too much Buffy the Vampire Slayer at a tender age for me. But for me, it was these 3 houses that everyone else finds charming and my heroine knows are seriously not okay.
And therefore the reader.
Yeah. Oh, spoiler alert. Sorry.
John, what about Pittsburgh? How do you build your mood from your setting?
Well, it's similar to Abir's, but on the opposite end of the spectrum, Pittsburgh is known for some pretty harsh and brutal winters. And because this story involved so much about covering up who you are and hiding and making yourself small, to me, setting it in the depths of a pretty bad winter, or in this case, it was a nor'easter that was going through the city over a couple of days. To me, it evoked feelings of keeping yourself covered and pulling yourself in. And so I think that mood carried throughout. It was how I felt when I was writing it. So I hope that was what the reader got from it. There was also something about time of day that was important for mine. A lot of the action takes place in the evenings over the 2 or 3 days that it takes place, and largely that's because the main character waits tables, and that's very much a nightlife sort of lifestyle, and many of the things, exciting things, dangerous things, happen at that time. And so I to carry over that mood and to keep tension going during those higher action sequences, not action per se, but I set most of them in the nighttime to also give you that sense of when it's dark, you can't see as well as you would see in the daytime. And so I think it lent to that mood as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lara, what about you in your Cold War Europe setting?
Yeah, I think for me, especially since my novel is a polyphonic novel, so it's told by all these different perspectives, most of which are first person perspectives. So mood for me is really tied to character and the details that these characters notice. And I think you can really get a sense of, what they're feeling, or what's, what they might be experiencing, or what's to come, based on the little things they're picking up from their surroundings. So, and I also play around with how those surroundings change versus, what emotions they're feeling with. So a train ride in Moscow to Peredalkino, where Boris Pasternak lived, it could be a thrilling train ride, but then at this, later on in the novel, it could be foreboding or a totally different circumstance, or walking into an office and you're hopeful to see your lover there. And then it changes towards the end, those details that they pick up, and the way the sounds of, walking across the floor can be a moment of joy in one part, but then a moment of fear and foreboding in another part. It's just all what they're picking up from their surroundings. But like John and Abir, I also, weather is very important to me. And I think with historical fiction, it's interesting because so many of the archives I consulted, letters and documents, weather is intricately described in these letters, and it's such a part of people's lives that, most of these letters talk about, what the weather was like on any given day. Anyone who's written about the past, it's very intricate. And so it does really factor into that sense of mood and place. And, like Abir, I wrote about DC, which is a swamp city, and what does it feel like there in summer, and, walking to work and just being covered with sweat, and what does it feel like to be in Moscow during the winter, and, just having your breath taken away by how cold it is. It's all important for me.
Now, Bill, you stretch your characters quite a ways. I mean, you start out in Chicago and off you go. So how does the mood shift with the progress that they're making on their road trip?
Well, I mean, when I think of mood, it's basically about the emotion I feel as an author, kind of spilling out onto everything that my character sees. I'm going to tell a quick story about how I got on a different book, where the place defined the mood of the book in a way that kind of shocked me. I was writing, it was about kids getting money, and then the money, you know, ends up ruining them. But there's an action scene that opens the book in a little place in Las Vegas, a little suburb, a little town in Las Vegas. And I went on Google and I saw the streets and I got the place and I had it all set up and I wrote that whole scene. And then I decided, you know, it's in Vegas, I'm going to go. So I went to see the place. And this was about in 2009. And it was right in the middle of the Great Depression. And in America, everything went bottom up. And this little, it's called Spring Valley in Vegas. It was like a neutron bomb had hit it. Everything had a for sale sign. The cars were covered with white sheets as if they were like corpses. And the thing I remembered was that the street signs were all covered in dust and no one had cleaned them, and you didn't know what street was what because you couldn't read the street signs. And I had such a sense, like I had such a sense of despair and what had happened to this neighborhood, that I went back and I changed the whole book starting from page 1.
Oh.
And I rewrote it with the sense that the same mood that I found in Spring Valley is the mood that I put in the whole book. And I even made my protagonist a mortgage broker just so that he was part of this whole thing that happened. And I'm not sure how the mood affects what we see, and then what we see affects the mood of the book. And it's kind of a magical process, which I find thrilling when I do it.
That kind of brings in a question that I have for three of you anyway. 3 of the books are set in a more or less historical. I mean, there's always these definitions of what is historical, but let's count Abir, Lara, and John as writing historical stuff. How do you capture a mood that speaks to someone in the 21st century is reading it? That is specific to Abir, 20s Calcutta. I mean,
that's a very good question. It's a really good question, and I think to be fair, there is a degree of cheating. You know, we can't have
cheating.
We can't have, well, I think there is. I mean, you know, I can't have my protagonist being 100% of that period, because likely he would have been racist and homophobic, and that's not particularly likable. So it's almost as if your main character, or at least for me, has to be a man out of time, a man or a woman out of time, who can hold up a mirror to the society that we are talking about, but still be relatable and likable to our present day audience. So when I say cheating, that's what I mean. I tend to use a character who could have been plausibly existing at the time, because we do know that there were men like Sam Wyndham out there. George Orwell was one of them. He was one of these people that was, you know, completely against empire, and he wrote about it in books like Burmese Days. So, but if I was to have just a typical 1920s British colonial man as my protagonist, his views probably would be quite different to what Sam's views are in the book, and he wouldn't have been as likable, and through that I wouldn't have been able to get my messages across. So if I want to hold up a mirror to that society, and if I want to take people along with me, I have to create a sympathetic character. He's not completely likable. I mean, he has many flaws. He gets most of them from me, but the fact is, I needed to create a character which my audience can relate to, but who can still interpret the period that I'm looking at. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, yes. It's sort of, it's a mirror, which is not the original thing. It's reflection, but it's there. Now, John, you looking at 90s Pittsburgh. I mean, that sort of familiar ground. I mean, you're not that much of a baby, but what kind of research did you get so that it was accurate, but but spoke to a later era too.
Well, I've had the comment made fairly often about how timely this book has been, but the truth is it's timeless. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. I mean it in that what was happening in 1995 is what is happening now, is what was happening in 1965. I mean, it's the research that it involved, not much, because I took a lot of personal experience from that time, but when I was writing it, it wasn't with the idea that, oh, maybe this will be timely when it comes out. This is the ugly, unfortunate history of our country, and it's so I felt that readers that would understand that it didn't really matter when it was set. If anything, I wanted to speak to the idea that it was timeless, that it didn't matter when it was set.
It's always the small things that trip you up, isn't it? With something that is that close to past and that you're writing because you remember yourself. And it's sort of like the dangers in the Sue Grafton books. As Sue went on, her characters became historical. I mean, they were contemporary when she started, but each book covered 3 months and and Sue covered a year or so in her life. And so by the time she was writing the end of it, she had to remind herself when cell phones came in and when Kinsey Millhone could have looked something up on a computer. So it's always those things that are tricky, as you say, okay, now, was that a popular song then, or was that 5 years later? Research is dangerous, isn't it?
Yes.
What about you, Lara? You sort of set things in a sort of semi-historicals.
Yeah, so it is interesting. I try to use as many, primary research resources as possible. So reading from books of people who experience these events that I'm talking about in the novel. But I know that, for me, half of my book is really fictionalized and it takes place in Washington, D.C. It's a group of CIA women officers, a group of women who were working at those early days of CIA. And I did a lot of research of histories of these women and who they were and what their lives were like. And I think I've gotten some, oh, but you're viewing it from today's standards as women rights and things like that. And that's a criticism I've read about my book from, people on Amazon or whatever. But then, I kept thinking, but I was reading the words of these women and how frustrated they were, where they were just as qualified as the men, but never could rise up from the ranks of the typing pool or records department of personnel. And they're very much overqualified. And while they never would call themselves feminists in the 1950s because it just wasn't a word on their lips, they certainly embodied it in many ways. And I felt really gratified after my book came out, and I met with one of the CIA typists who worked at the CIA during, I think it was like 1960. So my book takes place in 1958. So it was very much the same time. And she's like, you were right on. That's exactly the feeling there was. And we talked about it all the time. And even if we weren't as outspoken as women today, it was always on our minds. So I think it's hard for me to not get beyond my own experience of Washington, D.C. and certain things that I've experienced working as a woman in a male-dominated environment have, slunk into the narrative. But at the same time, I try not to be too heavy-handed and let my own opinions, become an anachronism for the time.
Mm-hmm. Now, Katrina, this book that we're talking about here is not historical, but you do write historicals. And I mean, do you have any particular thoughts as you're putting books together of how to build a historical thing that, I personally don't live like that, like Dandy did.
Yeah, no, Butler and a Dalmatian. No, I mean, what Abir said, it struck a chord with me. It's very much the same thing. I've got this woman who was born in 1885 and it's 1937. It's 1937 now, and it's like, oh God, here it comes. So she's English, married to a Scot, so she laughs at Scottish people. She wants to laugh at Scottish people, and I get to, so that's perfect. And she's posh, and I'm incredibly not. I once addressed the Dorothy L. Sears Society, and they were totally expecting Dandy Gilbert to turn up, and then I rocked up. They were so disappointed. So she's very posh, and she's a huge snob. But I suppose I'm thinking that in British society, I mean, you know, lamentably, not completely, but there is more mobility than there was, you know, where you started, or maybe this is me, a triumph of socialism, you know, went to a good state school, got a university grant, all that. Maybe not so much now. But I think her snobbishness doesn't have the power to hurt people as much as what might be her racism then could still just, you know, someone's just enjoying a book with a Dalmatian on the cover, having a nice day, and then, oh, you know, I don't want to do that to anyone. I take my book seriously, and I'll offend anyone, but I don't want to hurt anyone. So again, she's not a big honking racist, and because she's upper class, I'm not sure she would have been much of a homophobe. I mean, I don't think she would have been particularly sensitive, but I don't think she'd be very bothered. She doesn't have that middle class sexual morality knocking about anywhere. So it's exactly the same line that I've got, Abir, that I let her be of her time, and just like, oh, geez, I can't believe you said that about some things, and other things I say, no. So she gets to be sexist because I can find the line. She gets to laugh at Scottish people because I can find the line. And she gets to laugh at poor people because I can find the line. But if it's not my life, I don't go there. And funnily enough, Laurie, also, the hardest piece of research I've ever done was trying to work out if someone would use ready-made fondant icing in 1987. I spent a week and a half on that and couldn't find out.
Can I just say, Katrina, this laughing at Scots, I do it as well in my books. Is it therapy? Is that what we're doing? Is it just cheap therapy for us?
I think it's in case someone says, oh, look at them. You love yourself. That's an insult for Scottish people. In California, it's a goal. But for Scottish people, you love yourself. Like, oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Mustn't do that.
No, God, no. No, I can't. I forgot this was going to be public. I'm not finishing that sentence. I'll email you later.
It's not going to be, it is. Everybody knows, Katrina.
No, the thing I was about to say, I am not saying.
Okay, we'll keep that down. You can tell us after. I'll just tape.
I will.
Well, I don't know. Do you do historical?
No, I think this was Freedom Road when I doing the 1968 and the hippie stuff. That was about as historical as I get.
Yeah. So there's a certain amount of research there.
There was, but I have to say, you know, I'm old enough that Carlos Castaneda was something that I had in my back pocket too for a while. And
sometimes, again, it's when it's your own history, you sort of have to go back and you think, okay, did I do that then, or was that 10 years later?
No, definitely 10 years later. I mean, in 68, I remember I was in 5th grade in 68. And, but I did a lot of research. I did a lot of research about the communes, because that part of the book takes place in an old hippie commune that they went to, they tried to shelter in. And that was actually, there's some great books about that, and that was actually very helpful. And Laurie Groff has a really great novel about the communes too, called Arcadia, which was interesting. And it's all, you're just trying to create, and then of course you take all this research, and then you got to tell a story about, I told a story about a boy who stopped speaking on the commune and how he's running around. It was kind of cool. It was just, it's kind of, I love it. I like trying to take all these elements and then create something magic out of it. So that's sort of what it is. That's what it felt like when I did the research.
It is indeed magic. Now, once upon a time, PI books took place in LA and Chicago. Traditional mysteries took place in small towns or country houses. When you're building mood, how much do you make use of that setting as a sort of shorthand? And how much do you deliberately flip it around? Lara, let's start with you.
So how much, I mean, for me, place does have a mood to it. I think when you're thinking about Washington, D.C. versus other cities in the United States, there's a different feeling when you're in Washington, D.C., no matter the time period. And it is a feeling you're in this place that's a seat of power, but there's so much corruption. There's so many, dealings going on behind closed doors. It has almost a sense of secrecy and mystery to it built in. And I think, you feel that same way when you're in Moscow. It's like this head of a authoritative government, and even the buildings almost scream that when you're visiting, and of being built from this time that was to dominate. And I'm actually working on a book right now that's set in Pittsburgh, so I'm excited to read John's, because I'm from outside of Pittsburgh, and it's set in the 1930s, but Pittsburgh has its own place and feel, and the people there are very specific to the area. And so it's really hard to separate and flip that on its head. But I do enjoy when books will go into a place of a city or a time where that's not really known, or it's very specific to a neighborhood or to a family that lived there, and seeing it through their eyes. And I think that's really a cool thing when fiction writers flip that and say, this is the Washington you thought you knew, but look at, in my book, I have all of a party that goes on, and it's for people to connect with other people who might be gay, and it's a secret party, and it's a whole different side of Washington, D.C. that no one knew about, and that was going on in the 1950s. And so that's another lens to view that place and time period through. It was like, wow, I had no idea that this was something that was going on, and it changes my thought on it.
What about you, John?
Laura gave me the perfect segue there. Pittsburgh, for certain, had sort of this perception of Pittsburgh, and then there was the actual Pittsburgh. And while I'm not from there, I was a student there. I was there for about 6 years and got to really learn about the city, both from family that grew up there and then just my time there as a student. There, Pittsburgh is so well known for the steel industry and then the collapse of the steel industry, but there's also, people don't know as much about how that collapse and actually the ascent of the steel industry there affected surrounding neighborhoods like Homewood, like Wilkinsburg, which were areas that ended up being very much demonized when I was a student there, because they were areas of high gang activity. But there were also local issues with the police there that were escalating some of those issues. So I tried to explore some of those neighborhoods, some of the people that came from those neighborhoods, because in the time of John Edgar Wideman's writing, who's a really well-known Pittsburgh writer, he wrote very much about the cultural aspects of Homewood and what it used to be before it became this terrible, terrible place that you were never supposed to go. So to Lara's point, I tried to give people a different lens to look at the city and look at what's happened, because even now, since then, those neighborhoods that were so scary before are now being incredibly gentrified. So in trying to create mood and setting was also trying to draw attention to places that were somewhat looked at unfairly.
Mm-hmm. Katrina, how do you make use of the sort of mood that comes with a place, and how do you flip it around? Yeah,
I've been thinking while you've been talking, because I've just had real trouble with that. The book that I've finished, I went through 11 drafts before it went to the publisher. So it was my 29th book, and it kicked my butt hard, which is a horrible thing to find out, right? That you can be on book 29 and you haven't got a clue. One of them can just go, you think? Try again, pal. So, and I think, but since I handed it in, and it's fine, it's going to be published. But since I handed it in, I think the problem was that it was set exactly where I'm from, which is the sort of bordering on post-industrial wasteland of West Lothian in Scotland in the Central Belt. So the great monuments there are the shale bings, the big piles of slack shale from the shale oil industry that are just sitting there. I see them when I'm coming down on the plane when I'm going home, like, oh, the shale bings, I'm nearly home. So it's set exactly where I'm from. which is just gutted communities, and now lots of fairly trim-looking executive dwellings where people get on the train and go to Edinburgh or Glasgow, but high unemployment, and also it's set exactly now, so I couldn't move myself in time, and I couldn't go, oh, I'm gonna research this place and find out, you know, the one hook, the little, oh, that's interesting, I'll start from there, because it's where I'm from. And I had such trouble trying to ground that book in the place, which felt enormously frustrating, because I thought it should be easier, because I'm from there, my father's from there. But it was, I think, so distance is obviously how I do it. Just setting out with my sharp pencil and a clean notepad and going to find out about something is how I do it, because when it's knocking around my brain already, I couldn't get it to the front and make it useful. It was hard. I hope I did it.
I'm sure you did.
I think I did it. My agent I'm very lucky. My agent's wonderful. She does lots of editing before she lets anything out. And she just kept kicking it back and saying, dial it up some more, dial it up. Give us some more, just give us some more. So I think I got there in the end. But has anyone else ever had that experience of trying to write about something that you know so well you can't find it? Thank you for nodding. Don't leave me hanging.
Yeah, I think I've heard a lot from other writers that, you know, they have to, you know, I never wrote about DC until I lived in Texas, and I haven't written about Pittsburgh until I live in Texas either. So like sometimes
Right.
that distance, even if you're from there, it seems like it's crucial in a weird way. Not always, but for me, that's definitely been the case.
And then I found the two sisters who run a nail bar, and the guy who's got a corner shop on the street of, it's Broxburn, right? I've changed the name, but it's Broxburn. Ooh, the glamour. Once I'd found those characters, and I can't remember who it was that was talking about this earlier, to find a place through characters. Someone was saying that earlier. I think that helped a little bit.
Mm.
I've got to say though, Katrina, Broxburn.
How do you use the place and then flip it around?
Broxburn's posh.
Compared to where I'm from.
Okay.
I'm from deepest, darkest Lanarkshire.
Oh, my condolences.
Okay.
Sorry, Laurie.
Yeah. Abir, why don't you say something about the similar question of, you know, making use of the sort of image that comes with a place, but sometimes flipping it around?
That's a really good question. And I think that's much of what I try and do. I mean, in Britain, we have this great amnesia for our own history. We tend to look on, we tend to brush uncomfortable facts under the carpet. So we learn at school, we learn more about German history and Italian history between the wars than we do about our own colonial history. So people tend to view the Raj through rose-tinted specs. It's all sort of tea with the viceroy on the lawn, the down-to-ification of our history. And the problem is, you know, in a newspaper a couple of years ago, they did this survey where over half the population of the UK still believe that the empire was a force for good. And you think, you know, if you knew if you even knew a tenth of our own history, no, but people wouldn't think that. And so, I mean, I revel in the fact of exposing some of these fallacies that we have about our own history. In fact, one of the reasons I write is out of anger. There's the one thing that has caused me to write is what we call the Bengal Famine of 1942 to 43. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of that. Probably none of you. But while 3 million Jews were being gassed in Europe, 3 million Indians starved to death in a man-made famine, which was essential, which could have been avoided, but on Churchill's orders, it was continued. And my father, who was a young boy at the time in Calcutta, remembered bodies, you know, skeletons walking into the streets and collapsing and dying in the streets of Calcutta. And this is our history that we don't talk about. So very much what I try and do is try and tell people about these, but you can't slap people in the face with these sorts of facts because they'll stop reading. So what you need to do is you've got to bring in these little touches of history, maybe point to some of the hypocrisies, get your readers with you and then tackle the big subjects. So, you know, it's a gradual it's like boiling a frog, isn't it? You do it gradually, you know, you do it little by little. So in the first book, for example, I may point out some of the hypocrisies, such as signs outside of the Calcutta Club that say no dogs and no Indians. And the Indians are wondering, well, how did they get the dogs to learn to read? But, you know, it's little by little that you have to acclimatize your readership to some very, very, you know, difficult facts, shall we say. And that's a gradual process. So, you know, I set myself this idea that I'm going to write a book a year between 1917 and 1947, which is Indian independence. But that's 30 books. And I'm from Glasgow. And as Katrina will tell you, my life expectancy is pretty low anyway. Coming from Glasgow, we have the worst
high index. Yeah.
And so I'll probably be dead in 5 years. So I don't know how I'm ever going to get to the end of this, but that's the objective.
We all need a goal. What about you, Bill?
Well, most of my books I write about are from Philadelphia. I grew up in Philadelphia. My mom and dad grew up in Philadelphia. My grandfather, when he came over from Russia, he ended up at 4 years old in Philadelphia. In Northern Liberties, that's where they lived. So I sort of know it so well and the history that I can find the mood within the city, whatever mood I'm looking for. I'm writing a children's series now. It's a mystery ghost children's series. And I'm picking up all the really cool, fun elements in the city, like City Hall, which is like a ridiculously amazing building, and Independence Hall, and all these places. But when I was writing my mystery story set in Philadelphia, it was very much about class and about race and about the different levels of the city, which have been very strong forever, and about my character feeling left out of what was happening. And you could find that too. Whatever mood if you know the place well enough, whatever mood you're looking for, you can find it in there. So you can find the high fantasy, or you can find the corruption. Well, everywhere you can find the corruption, but you can find the corruption, and you can find the class structures that really choke things down and that you feel in your gut and all that. I love knowing the city well enough that I can pull out what I need for that. And so that's why one of the reasons I set things here, because I can find what I need here.
Mm-hmm. Down to the last couple questions here. One of the things that I'm always curious about, I am the kind of writer who doesn't work to an outline. I usually find out what the book is about sometime around the last chapter. And I'm always interested that I know beforehand what mood or what flavor I'm aiming at with the book. Why that should be the one thing that's clear in my mind when I start out, I really don't know. But I'm curious about the rest of you. When you start a book, before you even start writing it, do you have that emotional reaction on the part of the reader in mind? Do you have the mood in mind? Do you know that it's what you're aiming at from the beginning and work towards it, or is that something that gradually comes about? Katrina, let's start with you.
No, I mean, I'm not saying no, don't start with me. No, I don't. That's not what I've got. I often, my first draft is, what do you call those animals that's the front half of one and the back half of another?
Push me, pull you.
There you go. Push me, pull you. So I'll start thinking it's going to be one thing, and then, as I said, I'm a pantser, so it ends up somewhere very different. So the first draft's always a mess, and then, but the thing that I write towards is what the whole thing's destined to be. So I just have to fix once I've written the whole thing out and left it for a while, I just have to fix the first half. But no, that's not what I know. When you were saying that, I was thinking, I wonder what I do know, because it's not the plot. It's not the mood. Maybe a character, maybe.
So at what point do you see what the mood of that book is and work to strengthen it?
In the second draft.
So the second draft,
when I do that, yeah.
You get a sense of what the book should be, and that's what
Yeah.
you're working towards.
Yeah, at some point. There's some point, because I'm hope that someone's gonna nod while I'm speaking again this time, just throw me a bone. There's that moment where you feel like you've got thermals under you. You know, it's not great, but it's alive. You know, that moment where you suddenly feel slightly more buoyant about the process. And what it's like so that's the moment. I think it's interesting. I'll pay attention this time as I write, and if it derails my whole process, I'll get back to you. But I think that's the point when I realise what the what the tone and the flavour, what the scent of the book is, what the mood is.
I'm going to step in because I agree with her completely. But I start with, I have an idea of what the story is going to be and what the mood is and what the big moment is. And my feeling is, if I end up with those being exactly the same, then it's not going to be any good. There's a moment in the writing that something just starts lifting me up, just like Katrina said. And you go, oh my gosh, everything is different. And it might not be all that different, but it just feels emotionally like, yes, I found a key. And it guides me through. And that's the moment I write for, to find that.
Oh, thank God, this book is about something.
Yes,
exactly.
And it's about something better than I thought it was when I started. And it's about something richer, and oh my gosh, it might actually be okay.
Yeah. What about you, John?
I would agree with that, but I'd also agree with what you said in the beginning. To piggyback on something Lara said earlier, it always starts with character for me, and the one of my favorite phrases, and it's been attributed to a bunch of different writers. The one that I heard it most often was Vonnegut, but it was take your character, put him in a tree, and throw rocks at him, and see how they're going to react. That's kind of where I start, and that establishes a mood for me, and then I just sort of follow what I think is going to be their reaction path. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and then sometimes I get the thermals and find that I've found that spot where now I can just keep going and I know exactly where it's going. I don't know if that answers that question.
What about you, Lara? Where does it come for you?
It's interesting because I do with character and then with voice. Like, the voice is so hard for me to find. It takes so many different explorations of point of view and character study, and a lot of that's just in my head. It's some of it just gets splattered into the first draft, which is like, it's always this big sprawling thing, but it's always like thinking of who these characters are and how they will react. And I don't think I set out to make a point, and it's oftentimes that point is pointed out to me when I share my work and saying, oh, you were writing these untold women's stories to make this point. And I was like, well, it was just what I was interested in. So, and a lot of times I just try to inhabit the character and feel what they feel. And, when I'm working with history, I set out with this for my book, which is written, it's about Dr. Zhivago, which was a book the CIA used as a weapon during the Cold War. And the thought that a book could be used as a weapon was so extraordinary to me. So I start out with that and define the characters that are underneath that history. And so it is kind of an organic process, and it doesn't really get going until those thermals kick in. And I think once, you're showing it to your agent or editor and they're saying this is where you're going with this, let's see more of that, and it becomes refined to tell more of a complete story.
Mm-hmm. Abir.
Well, I'm a wee bit different. I mean, I'm in awe of the pantsers here. I'm an accountant by training, so you probably guess how I write a novel. I write it by Excel spreadsheet. I have a plot laid out, which is quite the only thermals I have are my underwear.
You probably cry less, Abir. I bet you weep less than I do.
You might be right, but when it comes to mood, to be honest with you, I think my books are almost therapy for me, and the mood seems to reflect the mood I am in. The sort of fundamental feelings that I'm going through. So the fourth book in my series, Death in the East, half of that is set in East London in 1905. Because what was really vexing me when I was writing it a couple of years ago was Brexit and the way we treat immigrants and all the chat around integration and how things hadn't changed in 100 years. 2015 was not that different to 1905. It was just different immigrants. You could take an article from a paper in 2015 and change the word Muslim to Jew, and it would have run 100 years ago, the same article. And so for me, it's almost the books are reflecting my mood, and whatever is vexing me goes into the book. And if I'm feeling upbeat about something, my characters tend to feel more upbeat. But where there's something that is bothering me, and which is most of the time, my characters are manic depressive. And so I would say it's the opposite for me. It tends to be the feelings that I have are what sort of goes into the book. It colors the book, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So these 5 books that we've been talking about were all published last year. And one assumes that you all have a new book out and that you're all working on another book, because this is an industry and we keep wanting to have a book every year. Can you say something about what came after this book, so that either say what you learned from it, what you didn't learn, what you were glad to leave behind, something about what's out this year or what's out next year. So the future moving on past this book. Let's start with you, John.
Keep starting with me. No, it's fine. I do not have a second book out or coming out yet, but it is done, and with my agent, and hopefully going out soon. What did I learn from it? That I definitely am not a series writer. Like, I have to do one-offs because I can't let that stuff live in my head anymore. Like, I at some point I need to leave them and move on. So I've considered following some of the characters from that book, and maybe I still will, but not in sort of a
Michelle.
that
would be my vote.
I have gotten that request. I've also gotten Robert from a book club, so I may do that as well. But anyway, the next book is actually it's set in Philadelphia. William would know the neighborhood. Manayunk is featured in there fairly often, in Lincoln and Kelly Drive. It's about a wait, am I supposed to tell you what it's about or no? Or were you just asking what I learned? I didn't want to. Okay. Short story, short version. It's about an aging mixed martial arts fighter who is losing his battle with CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and this is happening in the midst of him caring for his white father, who is also dying of Alzheimer's. And as his filters are falling away, he's starting to learn some things about his father that he's not so excited about.
Wow. Does it have a name?
Wall.
After the Lights Go Out.
So it's wall-to-wall chuckles again then, John.
Yeah, it's another feel-good. Yeah.
What about you, Lara?
So what did I learn? I learned that putting your book out into the world as a debut author, you think it's going to be over with and done with, a couple weeks after publication, but no, I am still out there promoting, the paperback of the book, and it just came out at the end of June, but it's a lot longer of a process than I thought it would, and more disrupting to my life than I thought it would, but in such a good way, because I still enjoy doing events and talking with readers, even especially now with COVID and being, locked in Austin, Texas, in my home. It's like a very much needed gateway to other people. But it was hard for me to move on from that first book. And I think a lot of people do experience it, that you're holding on to those characters and you're holding on to that place, and you kind of at one point just have to let it go. And so I think I've reached that point and working on this first draft of a new novel, which honestly will take me a few years. I'm doing a lot of research, and it takes place, as I said, it takes place in Pittsburgh during the Depression. I'm very much interested in a Federal Writers Project, which was a New Deal program that paid writers to find folklore stories or to write guidebooks during the Great Depression. And it's a lot of fascinating research, and I'm interested in folklore and history and the Catholic Church and all kinds of things. So I'm just following my obsessions right now and getting it down. And hopefully in a few years we'll have
That sounds fantastic. The
Mhm.
folklore detective angle. That
Yeah,
sounds great.
yeah. It's interesting. So much of that folklore has never been published, and we have some of our most famous writers who worked on it. You know, Nora Zale Hurston was one of them. John Cheever was
Right.
one of them. Richard Wright was one of them. It's pretty incredible. All of these famous writers worked for the Federal Writers Project, and
Yeah.
it's fascinating.
Yeah. Bill, what are you working on? What did you learn from this one? What is your
Well,
mood?
this was my bitter old hippie book. And I have to say, it felt like an ending in something. I kind of, writing about an old guy and his regrets, feeling my old regrets, and then having it end with blood and gore. And the whole time I was saying when I wrote this, I don't want redemption, no redemption. So he doesn't get redemption. But I was sort of done, and I started writing. I mean, I felt like I pushed that where I could push it, and now I'm writing for kids. I'm writing middle grade books, and the first one was Elizabeth Webster and the Court of Uncommon Pleas, which is a supernatural legal story, believe it or not. And I'm really enjoying it. The voice is really kind of thrilling. It's a different type of voice than I've ever written before, and I've really enjoyed that. And I have a new one coming out, the second in the series, since it's a 3-book series, Elizabeth Webster and the Portal of Doom. And so it's completely different, and it's been energizing and fun. So I've been enjoying it.
Lovely. Yes. We'll make sure that we get you on the next MWA young middle grade book. So, Abir, what about you?
As I mentioned, you know, what I try and do is I try and sort of push myself a wee bit further, because I'm still starting out. I'm only a few books in, unlike Katrina and Bill. And so the 4th book in my series, Death and These, is the first time I use 2 different timelines. I tell a story in 1905 and 1922 and bring them together. And there's a locked room mystery at the heart of both of them. I've always wanted to write a locked room mystery. It just took me 5 years to come up with something that might work. So that's out now. I've just handed in book 5 in the first draft of book 5 in the series, and that's the first time I'm using more than one voice of a character. And now I'm going to take a wee bit of a break from the series, and I am writing a standalone thriller which is going to be set in the US, and it deals with radicalization. And I'm loving it because it's very different to anything I've done before. But there are still a lot of dead bodies, which is great. So yeah, loving it.
Lots of dead bodies. What about you, Katrina? What do you got?
I've been trying to remember what I wrote after Strangers at the Gate. It feels like a long time ago now. I think it might have been back to the 30s, to Dandy Gilver, to Dundee, and a Punch and Judy show. I think that's what it was, which is just as, did anyone see Punch and Judy shows when you were a child? They're awful.
Scary,
I mean, they're just,
aren't they?
talk about our modern sensibilities not being able to cope with things. And people sat licking lollipops and watching this outrage.
Domestic violence.
Jeez, yeah, I mean, just awful. And Scaramouche with a stretchy neck. Ooh. I think that's what I wrote. What I learned from writing Strangers at the Gate was to appreciate my Bible, but not that way, because the protagonist here she's a cradle Catholic, but she spent some time in prison, and she was quite impressed with the Protestant prison chaplain, and so when she came out she decided that she would train as a deacon. So she's a church deacon now, which is not someone that irons the altar cloth in the Church of Scotland. It's someone that is basically a social worker with bad clothes. So she's a deacon in the Church of Scotland. So I spent more time trawling through the Bible for bits and bobs than I do on an average day. And well, Laurie, you're a theologian. There's everything in there. That's what I learned. Everything is in there. No matter what you're looking for, it is in there. It's bonkers, right? I mean, so I don't mean to offend anyone. You know, it's marvelous, obviously, but it's utterly bonkers. I mean, I knew about Leviticus being everyone's creepy uncle, but Deuteronomy, what? I was reading this stuff going, I need a shower. So that's what I learned was that how in a box set of DVDs back in the old days there'd be 3 good ones and one that you'd never want to see, but it gets lumped in with the other three. So I think I got that view of the Bible, just all the, not the greatest hits, all the other
You got
stuff.
the outtakes.
Wow.
Yes. Speaking as a theologian, that's quite a valid point of view.
Thank you.
Well, this has been marvelous. I'm so grateful to the five of you, and I suppose I should end this by saying this was a Mystery Writers of America Presents production. MWA's goal is to empower the professional mystery writers since 1945, and our motto is crime doesn't pay enough. So thank you very much for watching.
Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you.